I'd like to talk to you today about a troubling development that's taking place in our nation's schools. Transgender activism is not just a growing presence in our kids' school experience, but transgender activists have a very systematic and aggressive strategy for indoctrinating younger and younger children with an ideology that has no basis in fact or science. In 2018, David Aponte, then co-chair of the Northern Virginia chapter of GLSEN, formerly the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Educational Network, revealed in an interview with the Washington Post that California and Northern Virginia were being utilized as laboratories for experimentation with LGBTQ policies in the schools. I don't know about you, but I never agreed with or signed anything to allow my children to be experimented on at school. It's imperative that parents understand how aggressive, intentional, and deceptive the transgender agenda in our schools really is. These policies are being pursued at the local, state, and federal levels and are often referred to as SOGI, sexual orientation and gender identity policies, or SOGI laws. One of the trans activists' intentions is to get the term sex, as in biological female or male, replaced with gender identity in any and all policies and laws. This is one of the primary goals of H.R. 5, the so-called Equality Act. If gender identity replaces sex as a determiner of how you are categorized, the differentiation between man and woman and between girl and boy will be completely eradicated. While on the surface this may sound nice and egalitarian, what it actually does is remove all segregations between the sexes. Any boy may enter any girl's restroom, locker room, hotel room, or sports team simply by saying, "I identify as female." This is already happening all over the nation, as we'll see in a few minutes. GenderSpectrum.org, one of the trans activist organizations which provides materials for use in schools, outlines their very clear and specific war room approach to indoctrinating people with the transgender ideology. They focus their strategy on what they call entry points. Entry points often refer to weaknesses in your home or office security where criminals can access what doesn't belong to them. I think that analogy is perfectly apropos for what GenderSpectrum.org lays out as their strategy. Their 4 entry points are internal, interpersonal, instructional, and institutional. The internal entry point seeks to change the way people think. Activists have worked for years, piggybacking off both homosexuality activism and the civil rights movement, to reframe the way people think about gender and identity. By working to recalibrate people's beliefs about and understanding of what it means to be male or female, transgender activists laid the groundwork for moving to their next entry point, the interpersonal entry point. Here they sought to change the way people talk about gender and identity. No longer do we have a sex, we have a sex assigned at birth, as if obstetricians randomly threw the label boy or girl on each of us with no more reliability or validity than having tossed a coin to see if it lands on heads or tails. No longer are people men or women, but we are cis men or trans men, or cis women or trans women. We cannot simply look at a person and call that person he or she, but we must ask, what are your pronouns? And then comply with what that person wants to be called, whether it's she, he, they, ze, na, or literally any an infinite number of pronouns that the individual may elect to utilize. By requiring people to change the way they talk, the trans activists reinforce the way they prefer us to think. The third entry point is instructional. Transgender activists seek to get their ideology into every class, every subject, every conversation that your child experiences at school. History books are being rewritten to suggest that figures like President Buchanan may have been homosexual, since he never married and he had a male friend with whom he occasionally lived. People have asked me with skepticism, how can transgender ideology be put into something like a math class? Very simply, by creating story problems featuring transgender people, like this one. Jax came out as non-binary to their class in May. Now it is October. For how many months has Jax been supported at school in their new identity? The institutional entry point is where we are right now. The activists have successfully pursued this entry point scheme over the last several years, with few parents recognizing what was going on. If anyone questioned some of the materials, language, or curriculum being employed, we were told this was part of inclusiveness and non-discrimination and anti-bullying programs. Having gotten this far with their ideology, trans activists are now pursuing the creation of policies at the school, local, state, and federal levels to require that this ideology be not only accepted but embraced, promoted, and participated in by every single person in the United States. A teacher in Fairfax County, Virginia lost his job when he would not refer to a transgender student by the student's preferred pronoun. The teacher called the student by the student's preferred name, but simply chose not to use pronouns, since calling the student by the opposite gender pronoun created a conflict of conscience for the teacher, who did not believe that one can change gender. Simply avoiding pronouns was not good enough for the student or the school administration, and the teacher was fired. This is not an isolated event, and cases like this are appearing around the country at an alarming rate. Also on genderspectrum.org, one finds this quote by a transgender person who took place in a training, apparently with a number of young children. I was happy to see that the information that might seem controversial or surprising to us was taken at face value by the kids. Activists know that young children believe what trusted adults tell them, and they are exploiting this vulnerability for their own ends. Parents may be completely in agreement with the transgender ideology, but sexuality education, and especially anything that is controversial like transgenderism, belongs under the authority and direction of the parent, not the school or the state. Here you'll find a few materials that are currently being used in classrooms around the country. The genderbread person illuminates the myriad and infinite numbers of combinations one can create around one's gender identity, gender expression, biological sex, and sexual orientation. Besides having absolutely no basis in research, science, or professional practice, this graphic and the next, the gender unicorn, were created by young transgender volunteers who came up with these as a way to capture their notions of gender and sexuality. There is some debate about which individuals get credit for which graphics and which was designed first. But not open to debate is the fact that neither a doctor, nor a researcher, nor a scientist, nor even an educator created these ridiculous images, which are, by the way, clearly intended to be used to indoctrinate small children. This chart of gender pronouns is especially amusing, if there's anything to be amused about with this issue. You can see the declensions of the pronouns he and she, as well as they and ze. But you'll notice, outlined in red, the statement that there are infinite numbers of possible pronouns now. So whenever you meet someone, you must ask after his or her or their or zin preferred pronoun, know how it is derived for the nominative, objective, possessive, and reflexive cases, and make sure you never make a mistake, because using the wrong pronoun is now considered hate speech. Obviously, this is a ridiculous, unwieldy, and perfectly impractical, no, impossible expectation. Following are some books you'll find in our schools. Julian is a Mermaid is the National Educators Association recommended book of the month for June 2019. This is the story of a little boy who discovers that despite his anatomy, he's really a little girl. Here are some books you may find in your kids' backpacks. An elementary school principal in my district told people at a school board working meeting that elementary principals are working hard to get transgender materials into the libraries and classrooms. And they are succeeding. Many of these are on class book lists. Some are required reading. In February 2019, an elementary school in my district hosted a transgender activist who read the book I Am Jazz to 2 classes of kindergartners. I Am Jazz is a transgender storybook aimed at 4-year-olds and older. It relates the true story of Jazz Jennings, who was born male but transitioned medically to female. Jazz is currently a young adult who has a reality TV show. This event at the elementary school was put on with no parental opt-out. A disingenuously celebratory letter went home only days ahead, in English only, though the district is 27% Hispanic and Asian, and all other material goes home bilingual, with the word transgender provided once in the middle of its center paragraph. This reading was clearly not meant to be approved by parents before it was carried out. A father whose child is in this picture had this to say: "My son was in the I Am Jazz book reading in February. He came home and asked his mom if the doctor could decide that he was a girl someday and that he'd be a girl from then on because the doctor said so. An even bigger deal than that, though, was when we tried to talk with him about the event. He was extremely uncomfortable, like he thought he was in trouble when we were just trying to find out what happened and what he understood about it. He could obviously tell something wasn't right and had no desire to talk about it. I don't think anything taught in public school should cause a rift between parents and their kids. APS, HRC, and everyone else involved with this are deliberately using the natural trust young children have in adults, perverting it for their own ends and using the classroom as a way around parental authority for subjects they know very well are controversial. That's despicable." There are a number of things you don't usually hear about Jazz, and especially not in these celebratory readings. Jazz went on hormone blockers at the age of 11. When it was time for surgery at 18, Jazz's male genitals were so small, having not grown after feminizing hormones were introduced, that not enough skin existed to fabricate a simulated female genitalia. For the sake of the squeamish, I won't go into detail about how doctors worked to remedy that. I will say that after the surgery, Jazz's wound split open, essentially tearing the genital area into a gaping hole. Jazz has been adamant that such complications are rare and not to be worried about. But one of Jazz's tweets revealed the horror of seeing the new genitalia after surgery. "If you guys only knew," Jazz exclaimed. Exactly. You're right, Jazz. If people only knew. This is GLSEN's Transgender Model District Policy Handbook. They've written this for local transgender activism groups to use as a boilerplate for their own local school districts. Its 12 pages cover a wide variety of topics, from bathrooms to bullying, from definitions to dress code, from pronouns to parents. One of the handbook's key takeaways, however, is that parental interference should be kept out of their children's sexual orientation and gender identity unless the parents are supportive of transition. This has been one of the most troubling aspects of discovering what is happening in our schools. A pervasive attitude exists among activists and administrators that parents are untrustworthy decision makers for their children's well-being, and kids need to be protected from their parents' intervention. We see this playing out in the courts in places like Ohio, where a couple has lost custody of their own biological child because the child wanted to medically transition to the other sex and the parents would not approve of it. A judge awarded custody to the child's grandparents, who would permit the child to begin hormone therapy. In my own school district, I heard an administrator say that schools need to, and I quote, "help unsupportive parents who aren't quite there yet to move the parents along," unquote. This is an outrageously arrogant position for a school staff member to take. She evidently finds parents who question the validity of the transgender claims to be backwards, uneducated, and unenlightened, and she asserts that the school must take the lead to move the parents along. That's unacceptable. One of the most problematic parts of the GLSEN Transgender Model District Policy, in my opinion, is the staggering lack of research support for what's included in it. This handbook lists a total of 3 references, 2 of which are surveys, and the third is a collection of anecdotes. 2 of those 3 citations originated with GLSEN itself. That's exactly like when Big Tobacco cited studies back in the 1960s and 70s that promised us that nicotine was not a health hazard. But it was discovered later that the tobacco companies themselves commissioned those studies and determined the outcome they wanted before the studies even began. The studies cited by GLSEN don't represent independent, unbiased research by any stretch of the imagination. This page from the GLSEN Transgender Model District Policy admits that Title IX, a federal civil rights law that was part of the Education Amendments of 1972, does not include gender as a part of the protections under the term sex. However, lawmakers are trying to push a gender-based rewriting of the law at the federal level under H.R. 5. Currently, sex, as in male versus female, is still a protected distinction, which should prevent biological males from entering female-only spaces, and vice versa, and prohibits males from participating in women's sports. Lawmakers, at the behest of transgender activists, are also trying to redefine sex to mean anything and everything. For example, gender, pregnancy, sex stereotypes, sexual orientation, and intersex traits, which essentially renders the term sex meaningless for differentiating between males and females. And this is a problem because boys and men are already participating in girls' and women's sporting events. These photos show Terry Miller and Andrea Yearwood, two self-described trans women, which means biological boys who self-identify as girls, outrunning every other girl on their high school track team in Connecticut. Selena Sewell, a young woman on that team, had this to say about competing against biological boys. "We all know the outcome of the race before it even starts. It's demoralizing." This is Mary Gregory, a transgender powerlifter who recently swept 9 out of 9 events at a Masters powerlifting event. Mary was later stripped of those trophies by the RAW Powerlifting Foundation, who declared that Mary is actually a man. This is Mac Beggs, a biological female wrestler at a Texas high school who is transitioning to male, taking testosterone, but is still competing in girls' events because Texas rules do not allow otherwise. Mac entered the state high school wrestling competition in 2018 with a 32-0 record. To counter the unbelievable argument sometimes heard from transgender activists and advocates that there is no difference between men's and women's athletic abilities, let's look at this helpful set of graphics from StatHoleSports.com. Here you can see two groups under two distinct curves. The blue represents men's performance in the 55-meter dash in Connecticut high school track meets from 2017 to 2019. The blue line shows the average male's performance time. The pink curve shows the women's performance in those same events, and the red line shows the average female's performance time. The two purple lines on this slide represent Andrea Yearwood's and Terry Miller's times. They are clearly in the upper half of the men's curve, but lag behind the most elite male runners. But let's see what it looks like if we remove the rest of the men from the picture. Only 2 women in 3 years could have beaten those 2 biologically male runners. No woman could have beaten them both. This has been only a short, skimming the top picture of how transgender ideology and policy has made its way into our culture and our schools. H.R. 5, if made into law, will destroy the hard-won gains women have made in the last 50 years with respect to fairness, privacy, and protections. It would also become federal law, which would undercut all state and local efforts to maintain fairness, privacy, and protections for women, especially within schools. H.R. 5 and its related policies must be halted immediately. I'll leave you with a quote from S. Bear Bergman, an activist who told the Huffington Post in 2015 that, "I would be happy, delighted, overjoyed, I tell you, to cause children to disagree with their families on the subject of LGBTQ people. If it does not concern you that the parental right to raise children according to their family's conscience with respect to sexuality and gender is being systematically abrogated, it ought to concern you that parental rights are up for grabs at all. Because once parents no longer have authority over their own children's education, health, and welfare, the state will quickly and happily step in to fill that void. If we're happy with our government's handling of the rest of its authorities, we have nothing to worry about. But if our government's other policies in any way concern us, Turning the next generation of children over to them for ideological indoctrination should terrify us all.